His play, Freedom Corner, was a co-winner of the IHRAF Africa Human Rights Playwriting Competition. In 2022, his short story, The Hummingbird, took third place in the Share Africa Climate Fiction Awards. Alexander is currently the Deputy Secretary General of Kenyan Pen and a regional managing editor for the theatretimes.com. Welcome to Colombo, Alexander. So first of all, I would like to ask you to give a small introduction. I'm sure the readers and the Sri Lankans, some of the Sri Lankans are joining you for the first time. They would love to know who you are as an author. Some of the public personal details would be good enough for them to have a personal link with you.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say I'm very happy to be here and to interact with with this particular book fair, coming as I do from Africa. I really love international cross pollination and friendships, interactions. This is brilliant. Now, my name is Alexander Nderitu. That's how it's pronounced. I'm an author perhaps in every genre. As you pointed out, I wrote Africa's first purely digital novel. That was in 2001. So as you can see, I've been writing for slightly over 20 years. In this time, I've written novels, plays, short stories, and just about even scholarly papers on various subjects, but mostly literature and theater. And I'm also an editor. So as you pointed out, I've won various awards, and I'm involved in various literary movements, including Pen International. One thing, the most recent book, which is the one we'll probably be talking about today, is called King Bure is Dead. It's a work of poetry. And one very unique thing about me and my literary career is that I was literally born on William Shakespeare's birthday. That is April 23rd. So, and I am a poet as well. So I've always wondered if there is a connection there. Although I only found out that when I was in my 20s, that I was born on the same day as William Shakespeare.
Well, that's an amazing news. Now I think we are going to talk about King Bure is Dead. That's called Poems of Africa. What is this poetry collection is about, and what inspired you to write this poetry collection?
Yes. Interestingly, as I said, I write both prose and poetry. And I write. I've got several books of prose, short stories, novels. Incidentally, this book here was the first book I ever wrote. It's called When the Whirlwind Passes. You mentioned it. It's a novel. This is short stories. This is also short stories. And the one we're discussing today is poetry. Now, incidentally, I write poetry very slowly. I can rush through prose, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. But for poetry, I write at a very leisurely pace because each poem is inspired by something, something that affects me emotionally. And it could be on any topic. A lot of the poetry in King Bure is Dead has to do with relationships, love, breakups, marriage, that kind of thing. Some of it is political. But as you can see from the bottom, it says poems from Africa. So this particular set of poems is very Afrocentric. It describes various places in Africa, like giving an idea of what it's like to live in this part of the world. Culture, food, those kinds of things. So it's my second collection of poetry. and I've got another one coming out shortly. So what I do is I look at the poems that I have, because I write over time, and I then group them into various themes. So with this particular book, I just wanted to put the Afrocentric poems together, and they touch on various aspects of living on this continent, things like the languages we speak, the legacy of colonialism, like I said, relationships, and so on and so forth. So perhaps later I'll be able to read one or two, so that the viewers can get an impression of what is contained in the text.
Right now, I had to do a very small research on this work. So I was just trying to find the origin of the name Bure. Surprisingly, I came across a few origins. One said it's from, there's a Swedish descent, and another said a very old Scottish name. So what is this name? What does it represent? Can you guide us through that?
You should have, when you are doing your research, you should have started with African meanings, African languages. Now, the term Bure is tongue-in-cheek, because Bure in the Kiswahili language, Kiswahili is the closest thing Africa has to a lingua franca. It's very widely spoken in East Africa, where I live. Now, Bure means useless or empty. So it's not even a real name. So, and here we're talking about King Bure being dead. So when you say King Bure, you're actually referring to a useless king. So it's and in the text, we get to find out why he was named King Bure, and why he's not in the very end. The very last poem here is called "The Lament of King Bure." So he gives his own story about how African kings lost their glory, and they're now considered useless.
All right, so I think I went through the wrong type of research. Anyway, now that it's clear who Bure is. Now, next question is, I mean, your cover, it was just amazing, but there are a few things I would like to know. If you look at the whole cover page, we can see on top of there's kind of a cross, and then there's a big emerald, and right under that, the symbol of African continent in gold. So it was very intriguing. I just want to know whether you are using symbolism to say that in the colonial times, the men who came in search of gold, glory, and God, do you represent that? Or what is the symbol of, is there any type of symbolism in this cover?
Yes, you're very perceptive. There is some there are some implied meanings there. The only thing you left out was the purple color, because purple is the color of royalty. But yes, with I noticed the crown. There's an empty the crown. There's no one wearing the crown. That's because King Bure is departed. King Bure is dead. But the cross at the top of the crown is very important. And inside the text, we do talk about how Africa lost their lands during colonialism. A history that is repeated in Asia and other parts of the world, and the role that Christianity played in that. But the reason for Africa being there is to make it clear that this was an African king who is departed. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, the gold, the color gold, it represents the wealth of Africa, and the jewels themselves, the richness of the African continent. And this is something I've discussed, I've written in prose, and will continue to do, because there's this really amazing contradiction with the African continent, where underground in the Earth's crust, it's the richest country in the richest continent in the world, but above ground, we are told we are the poorest and so forth, and we are like, it's a very rich continent, not just in minerals, but in other things as well, such as culture and so forth. But the reason there, but you're right. That's where the jewels and the gold, they just showed the wealth that is possessed in Africa, and that was hoarded by the royal families and so forth.
It sounds very familiar. Sri Lanka being another place which was colonized at some point at the time. So robbing our treasures, robbing our cultures was something that the Africans, Asians experienced. But I'm glad after years and decades, people start to talk about it. Now, the King Bure, you're creating a fictional kingdom. Why you think poetry? Why did you select poetry to build this kind of a fictional world? Why didn't you select instead of poetry maybe a fictional writing?
Yes. In all my writings, and a lot of writers do this. You want to. It's not just because I performed some of the poems in this book in front of audiences, and they always say, "Oh, it's so amusing." It's almost some of them, including the title poem, are almost comedy. But always in all my writings from the very start, it's the old method of entertaining and educating. Now, I don't want to get into too much controversy when I'm trying to pass on a message. In fact, the first title for this book was King Fulani is Dead. Now, Fulani is another Kiswahili word. It just means somebody, no one in particular. So saying King Fulani means some king is dead. But the problem was that in Africa, Western Africa, there's an actual Fulani dynasty. So I didn't want people to think that I'm referring to a particular dynasty. So I changed I looked for another word and I used King Bure. Because there are certain morals, certain messages I want to pass along. So it's much easier to use a fictional kingdom as a vehicle. In fact, I'll be writing a romance prose that is set in Uganda, which is a country next door to Kenya. And I wanted to use royals, but the main royal family will be fictional, because with something fictional, you've got all the leeway in the world to say whatever you want. But when you deal with real institutions and real people, you have to be very careful. And even if whatever you say is 100% true, you could still be in controversies and things of that nature. So it's much, you have much more freedom when you work with fictional material.
Right. Next one is a very technical question. So what's your style of poetry? Is it like freestyle, or what is the style that you're following?
That is a subject that is very popular in writing discussions when poetry is discussed. Now, earlier I mentioned William Shakespeare. That's one of my favorite poets, and he was doing sonnets and things of that nature, traditional verse forms. Now, free form poetry, or what's called free verse, is actually the most popular style of poetry in the world. It's also the most controversial. Now, some of mine, well, the majority of mine are free verse, but a lot of them are actually very well structured. It's either couplets or things of that nature. So actually, personally, I actually prefer the more traditional formal styles. Like I said, I divide my poems into different, I group them according to themes. So like in the next collection, there's something called a roundel. In fact, it's so particular, it's called a Chaucerian roundel. So when you do something like that, if you're going to do something like a haiku or a sonnet or a roundel, you have to be very specific to follow the rules. Now, the majority of people, they want more freedom, so they use free verse, which is a very legitimate form of poetry. And I remember a professor here in Nairobi at a writing workshop telling us that free verse does not mean verse that is formless. It means a verse that finds its own form. Poetry that finds its own form. Yeah, but does not mean formless poetry. So about 70% of what I write is free verse.
Right. Now, I also think that poems have their own limitations when you have to describe situations, events, and places, unlike a written fiction. So, how do you overcome this limitation? Because you can use X number of words, and you have to maintain a style or a structure. So that limits you on on one line. So how do you overcome your limitation?
That is so true. It's probably one of the reasons why I write more prose than poetry, because one of the key characteristics of poetry international is the economy of words. They're usually very spare, uh, but it's supposed to be punchy. So when you're that limited, you might have a problem conveying the full message that you wanted to. For example, with this particular book, in the title poem, which talks about King Bure, in the very first poem, which is kind of lengthy. So one way is to just have more stanzas, more verses until you feel you've said what you wanted to say in that particular piece. But in this particular book, in the beginning we talk about the death of King Bure. But as I concluded, the other poems over there talking about other things. As I concluded the book, I realized I felt to say more about King Bure. Why, for example, how he lost his glory and so forth. In fact, the whole Bure dynasty, which is fictional, how they lost their glory. So I wrote yet another poem. So if you can add more stanzas, or you can do more poems along the same theme. It's the same as a book series. You have sequels, whether it's Harry Potter and so forth. It's not one Harry Potter book. There are like 7 of them. So if you stack them all into one, it would first of all take a long time to write, but then it would be too big. So you can do so it's the same thing. You can do more than one poem on the same thing or about the same person or subject, because you do want to be, like I said, with free verse you have more latitude, but you will be, if your prose, if your verse forms sounds too much like prose, you will be criticized, because economy of words is one of the aspects that is key in poetry.
All right. What were the challenges that you faced, like the most challenging or the obstacle that you faced bringing this project to life?
Oh yeah, well, the biggest challenge is always has to do with the actual production of the book. The printing cost and things of that nature, editing, and later the marketing and distribution. Now, in Africa, this century there have been a lot of advancements, especially technologically. Especially one of the big things being digital technology, another thing being internet and later social media. These have helped bring out writers, help promote books, help people network, help collaborations within the continent, as well as international collaborations such as this one. So, but some challenges still remain. When it comes to things like editing, you still need to get good editors, proofreaders, and so forth. Cover design used to be a big issue, because normally the writer might have some ideas, and the person designing the cover, might struggle to get the author's vision, and then also you might want, for example, various images or graphics, and it might be difficult to acquire those. Now, on the cover of this particular book, King Bure is dead. That the crown is an actual photograph that I purchased online. However, starting this year, because of all this hula baloo about artificial intelligence, I have been experimenting with artificial intelligence for graphics, not for writing or editing, just for graphics, and I found it quite interesting. So the book I'm currently working on, the cover will be made. The central image of the cover is generated using artificial intelligence. It takes very short time and costs nothing. The program, the particular program was used was Starry AI. But the main costs, whether you self-publish or you're published by the mainstream publisher, for the publisher, the main costs have to do with printing, especially if you want quality printing, and of course distribution. Getting them into bookstores and things of that nature, and marketing. And that's why book fairs like this one are important. These are places where people can get some assistance or some exposure when it comes to things like marketing, sales, and just like industry and networking.
Yeah, it's quite understandable. Now, I believe every writer brings their own personal experience as well as interpersonal relationships when they are doing their creations. So in character buildings, with all the characters in the King Bure's that the poetry collection, how did it impact, and whether your personal experience, did you express it in this? How was it helpful, and what kind of a role it played?
Absolutely. Someone said that when a writer writes, it's like a painter dipping his paintbrush into his own soul and then painting a picture. Consciously or subconsciously, your own thoughts, emotions, positions in life, philosophies, they seep into your work unless you consciously stop that, or you have an editor who corrects it, removes that. I have no problems at all with my personality being reflected in my work, especially when it comes to poetry. Poetry is a very emotional type of literature, perhaps the most emotional, and some say the purest form of literature. Now, for example, even from the title, or rather the subtitle, Poems from Africa, it gives you a hint that this work is Afrocentric, it's Pan-Africanist, and I am a Pan-Africanist. There are also some specific things. For example, there is a poem called "Everybody Knows a Kamau," and in the poem, the persona in the poem is comparing Nairobi with other cities in the world, and is appreciating what his city Nairobi has to offer. Well, like life in Nairobi, the matatus, which is a public transport, and the beautiful people, the food. He's saying the food is so much better than in most other places. The music, so he's appreciating those kinds of things. So the poem is called "Everybody Knows a Kamau," and Kamau just happens to be a very popular name. It's like Khan in Pakistan, or John in the UK. And in actual fact, I do know many Kamaus. Like I used to work on an NGO. The boss was called Kamau. I used to, while I was living before, the landlord was called Kamau. I have friends called Kamau. So so that is stuff that is inspired directly from my life. There are other incidences that may not be about my life directly, but about things that I've observed. For example, there's a poem, it's titled Cloud Romance, and it's inspired by actual incidences where people have posted personal photos on computers or whatever, on your iPhone and so forth. It's in a cloud somewhere, and they get leaked, and there's these scandals and things of that nature. So almost every poem, like I said, there are poems that touch on colonialism and things like that. So I was not there during the time of colonialism, but I'm descended from people who went through it, and have obviously been been studying it for a while. So all these things that affect me as a person and inform my decisions and my worldview, they are reflected in my work.
All right. Now, Africa is such a diverse place, and you talk about traditions, customs, rituals, politics, power struggles, a whole lot of things. So, what are the key takeaways in this book for your readers?
Yes, but I do hope that when you write something like this about a particular place, a book that has got a strong sense of place, you're hoping that you're educating people who are not familiar with that place. I talk about Kenya, Nigeria, Africa. So what I'm hoping is that when someone gets a hold of this book, especially someone who is not familiar with African countries and African cultures, and like you say, they are very diverse. The continent is massive. There are 1.4 billion people in 54 different countries. Some countries are desert countries, and we have every race you can imagine. There are Caucasians born here, the Negroid population, Caucasoid population. Like, it's very different. And by the way, the world's largest gene pool. I remember watching a documentary where they were saying that there can be more genetic diversity in one Nigerian city than in all of Asia. That's how deep the gene pool is on this continent. So I do mention various places, like I said, Nairobi, Nigeria, South Africa. You see some things there about Zulu culture. So obviously, in a book, it's not a very big book, so it doesn't capture the whole continent. But you get these glimpses, because we don't see too much of positive African information or news, in Western media. So this is our way of telling our own stories and sharing our own cultures. In fact, the first poem is King Bure is Dead. The second one actually talks about how Africans interact with foreign languages, and how we distort them, and how you do, and how we've sort of customized them. And it also brings out the fact that, for example, there are more French speakers in Africa than in France, and there are more English speakers in Africa than in all of England. So those kinds of things are contemplated in this book.
Okay. Can you also give us an insight about your other work? I mean, I remember you already showed few of your books. Can you, because since you are talking, I believe, first time to the Sri Lankan readers, give us some idea about what you have done and what are your other books. And if you can show us the books, that will be great.
Gladly. Before King Bure is Dead came out, my other big book was this one. It's called Disco Matanga.
Disco Matanga, right?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a collection of short stories, again from Africa, and they are love stories. This particular one is as love stories, and I'm currently writing the sequel to this. So these are African love stories. I'm writing. It's about to come out. It's crime stories. These are 10 love stories. I've got 10 crime stories about to come out. This was my first poetry book. It's
The
titled
moon
"The
is
Moon
made of green cheese.
Absolutely. Again, there's a hint of humor there. So it was the first one. The King Bure is Dead is my second one. But in fact, earlier when you're doing my introduction, you mentioned a poem of mine called "Someone in Africa Loves You," that was on poetry postcards, Commonwealth poetry postcards. That poem was from this particular book. I've got novels. This was my first novel, When the Whirlwind
Passes.
Yeah, which you mentioned in your in introduction. I also have stage plays. The biggest of which is titled The Talking of Trees. It's about Professor Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan conservationist who won the Nobel Prize in Peace for her work in democracy, as well as in conservation of the environment. So she's world famous, Professor Wangari Maathai. In fact, she's Kenya's single most famous woman. The only person who comes close would probably be Oscar winner Lupita Nyong'o. So the Talking of Trees is about her life, death, and legacy. So as you can see, these works are quite diverse. There's a novel, there are poems, and there are plays. And like I mentioned, I've also written some more scholarly articles, which are available in places like academia.edu. Because apart from writing fiction, I'm also a critic, mostly a theater critic. So we watch these plays and do analysis.
Right. So I heard in one of your interviews a couple of years back with KTN News Kenya, I suppose, that you mentioned that the writing space has improved. The writers get more opportunities in their career. So could you please let us know, there are two questions, guide through your writing journey, from the time that you started up to now, as well as can you tell the Sri Lankan lit community what is the writing space like in Kenya?
Oh, yes. Now, as I mentioned, my first novel was also Africa's first digital novel. I didn't plan for that. What happened was, until recently, fairly recently, until this century, it was really hard to get published. It's still hard to get published around the world, even today. But it was even harder then. I remember when I first wrote my first manuscript, I went to the Yellow Pages, which, people these days probably don't remember what that was. That was a big book with a lot of phone numbers, and you'd have to go through it manually, looking for various businesses. And there were just like 5 publishers, and in Kenya, and all of them were interested in textbook material, which, by the way, is still the biggest market for books. But I was interested in being a novelist, like Robert Ludlum and Jeffrey Archer and these kinds of people. I was not interested in writing curriculum material. So because I couldn't see any publishers of the kind that I was interested in, at the time I was doing IT in college. I started to read in foreign magazines about ebooks. There was this new ebook technology, and people like Stephen King were experimenting with it, payment systems, things of that nature. And I thought to myself, how come we don't have ebooks in Africa, or it's even harder to get published than in the UK and the US? And then it hit me, that the technology simply hasn't arrived. People are not aware of this emerging technology. So my first book, I initially wrote it around 1999, 2000. So I turned it into it came out as an ebook in 2001. I was very young back then, and naturally it was the first purely digital novel. After that, things improved. We got print on demand. This was very good. By the way, when I wrote that first novel, Amazon existed, but they didn't even have the Kindle, and the Amazon Kindle is now the most important piece in the ebook universe. But later, as the years went on, technology improved, including what is now known as a print on demand, where if you see an ebook in a place like Amazon, you can also get a print. You can pay in advance, and the book will be printed and delivered to you, even if it's just one book. This changed the game totally, because before that, they used to use a totally different method of printing called offset, and that only worked for bulk printing jobs. It's still used for newspapers and things of that nature. But with digital printing, people were able to now publish smaller numbers of books. And this was good for both the authors and the publishers, because sometimes you're not sure how a book will do in the market. So, for example, if you're a publisher and you're printing somebody's autobiography, with print on demand, you can either make a very have a very small print run, or no actual print run at all, and just wait for someone to make an order, and then then that one book will be manufactured and delivered. So this kind of thing helped improve the literary landscape here. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the explosion in internet technology. The whole world became connected in the last 25 years or so, into the internet and later social media. These things helped exponentially, because right now, collaboration with people an agent in the UK and a fellow writer and promoter in Nigeria. Right now they'll probably be contacting me anytime now on my WhatsApp, was involved in different projects. This thing never used to exist. So in Africa, we now have more literary magazines, more collaborations. We borrowed a leaf from Europe. We're not afraid to admit this. We borrowed the idea of book festivals, literary festivals and salons, and things of that nature from Europe. For example, the first major festivals we had in this country, and which I was happy to be a part of, was the Storimoja Hay Festival. Now, the Hay Festival is something that takes place in the UK. So the promoter, Modoni Garland, was in the UK, and she saw this big festival, and people were coming out and attending in their thousands. And she partnered with the organizers and started a version right here in East Africa. And since then, we've had so many those kinds of things, and up until COVID really messed things up. So the literary landscape has really changed in Africa, and globally has really changed over the last 25 or so years. And I've been trying to be as on the cutting edge as possible. Earlier on, I mentioned artificial intelligence. It's a bit scary right now. We're not quite sure where this thing is going to take us, artificial intelligence, but it's obvious it's here to stay. So personally, I'm trying to look for ways it can help writers and publishers. A study was done in Germany earlier this year. I forget the name of the publisher, but it's a very big publishing house. And the conclusion was artificial intelligence can actually speed things up. It's actually helping more the publishing industry more than it's hurting. For example, that particular publishing firm has been hiring more editors, and also able to do better work on graphics and things of that nature. So technology has been the game changer. That's the takeaway here. And because the talent was there are so many talented African writers, so many gifted people. You can get material from Africa, stories from places like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. You can get poetry from Somalia, which is AKA the land of poets, stuff that would make you cry. And you see this material and you wonder, why aren't these people famous? But the fact was, until now, it was very hard for us to expand it internationally. And that's one of the reasons why I'm glad to be here and to talk to you, because I'm helping spread the message, and share African literature with the rest of the world.
Right. How do you see the influence of various colonial powers? Now, Africa was conquered by, or rather colonized by, a plethora of different colonial powers, from French to Belgium to Great Britain. So each of these European powers had their own different cultures, which was dominant in their own domain. So how do you see, in a global picture for African lit world, how did the colonization impact? Because, for example, now we have heard a lot of heroes who are anti-colonial heroes from Africa. Even they are very famous here. So they gave birth to movements that were anti-colonial, as well as it was kind of a freedom movement of freedom. So how did this the entire colonization and the Cold War, all this political spectrum impacted the new generation writers like you?
Oh, colonialism changed Africa forever, forever, completely. So much so that even in the in the areas where the colonialists have departed, we're still not completely out of the yoke of colonialism. We're still dealing with neo-colonialism. Even the language I speak now is a colonial legacy. In Kenya, we are colonized by the British. I should probably mention that I also speak and write in other languages, two other languages, my native Gikuyu language, and also in Kiswahili, which is the national language. And I'm proud to do those things. However, English is compulsory. Not just compulsory, but we in a lot of countries across the sub-Saharan Africa, vernacular languages are not just discouraged. You can even be punished in some schools for speaking in your vernacular. So you can see colonialism hasn't faded, and it came in various forms. The spectrum was so wide, we cannot even discuss it in one day. It traversed everything: politics, culture, all aspects. So we're still looking for ways to deal with the reality, because, like I said, the continent changed forever. For example, the borders, the countries we have, even the names of those countries are colonial relics. And some of those borderlines are very controversial because they would cut right through communities. So, for example, to the south of Kenya is a country called Tanzania. And there's a border, the border that divides Kenya and Tanzania. There are Maasai people on both sides of the border. There are also wildlife on both sides of the border. So when someone says they're traveling from, when someone, like if you have to travel, go from Masai Mara Game Reserve to the Serengeti in Tanzania, in actual fact, it's the same wilderness. It just has a border across it. So some of these border lines were arbitrary and very controversial. In fact, it would later cause a lot of conflicts some border conflicts that some of which reverberate to this day. Now, the early writers, the original writers from the continent, some of whom you may know, like Chinua Achebe and Goge wa Thiong'o, of course, talked about colonialism and post-colonialism. In fact, for Goge wa Thiong'o, who has severally been nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature, that was his main theme, the aftermath of colonialism. Because, like I said, after colonialism, we realized there was something else called neo-colonialism, and we're still, to a large degree, dependent on the former colonial powers, in our case, European powers. And some of this is touched on in my book, King Bure. Is a poem called, like I mentioned the poem, it's actually called Thank You, Very Beautiful. So it just talks about the linguistic legacy of colonialism. And it's a topic I read about, like I mentioned, I mentioned my other book of short stories with African love stories. And in it, it does mention colonial legacies. Although in this particular book, Disco Matanga, the short stories, there is a place where it talks also about a positive aspect of the coming of the white man, because not everything was bad. There were some things like technologies that they brought, or rather other things that we're not using, like for example, cash crops. We didn't have a coffee industry, tea industry until colonialism and so forth. and those are things we are still depending on. So not everything was bad, but a lot of it was terrible. It was atrocious. We deserve reparations for some of the horrific things that were done. But in this book, I do mention, for example, a dance called Mwomboko. It's common in where I come from, in the highlands of central Kenya. It's a mixture of traditional African dance and Scottish dances, and it's usually played with the help of an accordion. And in the book, I say that it's probably the most beautiful dance in the world, and it's also a legacy of, as it happens, of colonialism. So these things clearly do affect me. I'm not the first gen. I'm probably that generation of African writers, and I'm still writing about colonialism. At this point, the war that people like me would be fighting is uh, ideological. It's ideological, and we don't fight with guns and pangas. We're fighting more on the level of ideas and knowledge.
Right. I think colonialization, the neo-colonization are all global issues that Asia, Africa, Latin America is facing, and in this type of atmosphere, I guess writers find inspiration in that too, to talk about that and bring about the problems. So I have one more question, as well as I would like to give you the opportunity to present three of your favorite poems in your book. And may I request you to read at least one poem related to colonization, if you don't mind, when you're reading your book, poems. So my last question for you before you start reading your poems is that can you give a glimpse of your future projects once, now that this book is already out? What is your plan, and what are your future projects?
Oh yeah, this year I set myself a very ambitious project, which is to release 10 books, solo books, with no assistance, no help from co-writers and no researchers. So far I've released 5. I'm working very hard on the next 5, and it's a lot of work. My vision is blurry, looking at staring at the computer screen for so long. But I will manage. The next one, like as I mentioned, is a collection of crime short stories. It's titled "A Body Made for Sin." I'm very excited about that one. I've been writing it for a while. Crime is a very popular genre, and also in the same month, because the year is about to end, and I'm on book 6. The next one is actually a work of poetry as well, because like I told you, I've got very many poems, so I divide them so that I can along themes, so that I can go into different books. I'm also in the process of launching a literary online presence called the African Griot. So it's theafricangriot.com. It's a literary magazine. It will mostly do reviews and things of that nature. It's up, but it's still under construction. It's Africa's most recent, most newest literary journal. It's going to be online. I've had one play done this year, the Stacey Walker Interview. It's a romance. It's only romance written as far as theater goes. Most of my plays are comedies, apart from the one I mentioned earlier on Wangari Maathai, the Talking of Trees. And the Talking of Trees, by the way, reverting to to the earlier question, also because it's historical, also brings in the issue of the Cold War, because it takes place over a long time, from the 1960s, and ends shortly after the death of Wangari Maathai around 2011. We do see like the ideological changes that are taking place in the country. For example, during the Cold War, Africa was in the middle of the East and the West. So we're being pulled in different directions. And for example, in East Africa, Kenya was pro-West, Well, Tanzania, which neighbors us, was moved towards socialism. So we are capitalistic and they were socialist for a very long time. And they are neighboring countries, but they became very different because of the different political ideologies. So so got quite a number, like I said, so got quite a number of books to go and a few other projects. Some of them are some collaborative projects that we're doing, interviews, things of that nature. But I'm really excited about this project called the African Griot. A griot, for those who are not familiar, is a traditional African storyteller, and sometimes they would sing. And the work of the griot in a village, they were popular, most popular in. They were called griots. They existed across the continent, but they were called griots in Western Africa. And the griot, his work in the village was to hold the stories of the community, including genealogies and histories. So if you wanted a sense of identity, you'd go to the griot and ask about various histories, and he'd have the mythology and so forth. And sometimes they'd sing out these stories, sometimes they'd just narrate them. And that was a special role. He was like the library of the community, because in Africa, oral literature is and still is very strong. So the project is called the African Griot, theafricangriot.com. And what we are doing essentially is we are looking for modern day griots, who are the modern day storytellers telling the story of Africa.
Thank you so much. I think it's time for you to read read from your poetry book. I think we have time to read at least 2 to 3 poems, and you could pick and select which you like. But you have to tell us why you selected those poems. By the way, I wish you all the very best with your ambitious project. I hope and pray that it comes to being very soon, and you will have very less issues, but more good luck and positivity towards your project.
Thank you. Okay, so I think it is only fair to start with the title poem. King Bure is dead. King Bure is dead, screams the headline of the morning paper, which confounds me, as I had no idea King Bure was alive. I think that journalism should be buried along with that useless royal, because instead of incisive news and analysis from near and far, the dailies seem obsessed with trivia, opinions, and the lives of stars. That's why they are always saying things like, King Bure is dead. I find the journalist in question at a local bar and say, I'd engage you in a battle of wits, sir, but I can see you're totally unarmed. So here's my 2 cents. Why not be an objective reporter? The media should tell people about things that matter. But since the mind has no firewall, you're peddling propaganda. After this, you'll probably go back to distracting your readers with such alarming headlines as King Bure is dead. Next, I storm a university and confront a professor. I say, the education system is an epic failure. What's the use of algebra except to make us left brain prisoners? Y equals to X plus Z, find X. What on earth for, teacher? Why not tell kids the truth about nature, arts, science, philosophy, history, their ancestors, how to build a house, a car, an aeroplane, a boat, infrastructure? The useless information that's currently being stuffed into their heads is the equivalent of a local newspaper screaming, King Bure is dead. Arriving home, I find my African queen with a face like thunder. Where have you been? She inquires. I had to go to the grocer, fetch the kids, help with the homework, and still make dinner. I don't like the tone of her voice, so I decided to counter. How can you start a quarrel at a time of disaster? What disaster? She says, turning away her nose like she smelt a skunk. My mind swims around like a shark in a tank. Haven't you heard? I finally declare. King Bure is dead. Now, the next poem I'm going to read is titled, Thank You, Very Beautiful.
Thank you. Very
And it
beautiful,
touches,
is it?
yes, and it touches on what we spoke about earlier, about the linguistic legacy of colonialism in Africa. So, thank you, very beautiful. Language is essential for communication and culture, it's true. But in Africa, we rarely speak our native tongues thanks to colonialism. Still, the last laugh is ours because we've distorted foreign languages such that they are very recognizable to the original speakers. Whether English or Arabic or French or Portuguese or German, we've molded these languages for our convenience, flipping words like burgers. Charlie becomes Charlie, champagne becomes champagne, and so on. The queen must be rolling in her grave because we do not speak English of the nose. We just say whatever sounds like English, even if it is not grammatically correct. We no go and debate what is right or wrong. We can speak Pidgin or Creole, safe. We might even mix English with native words if we decide to. What you gonna do now? Ban us from speaking the very thing that you foisted on us. Crazy thing is that there are more French and English speakers in Africa than in France and England. You need us more than we need you. So we are gonna twist the language like screws. We'll say small, small instead of incrementally, and replace weird or odd with funny, funny. Regardless is interchangeable with irregardless, and the opposite of furthermore is now motherless. Specific may as well be Pacific, and remuneration, remuneration. To understand something very well is to understand it, isn't it? The children's game, pick it, point it, is now picky, picky, ponky, and so on and so forth. Is we together? Thank you, very beautiful.
Well,
Do you,
can
do you have time for any
and you have one more poem to read, and this was an amazing piece.
Oh, okay. Let me see. I hope you get this one. It has a crazy title. It has an amusing title, but it's actually about something that is very real and very common. I'm sure this happens in Asia as well. It's about NGOs that come to people's countries purporting to help them. So the title
INGOs.
is NGOs. Yeah, international NGOs.
Non-governmental organizations.
Absolutely. The title is Toothbrushes for Crocodiles.
Okay, can you repeat it again? Toothbrushes of
toothbrushes for crocodiles.
Toothbrushes of crocodile. What a topic.
Yeah. Yep. I went in to the donor's office like a lion and came out like a lamb. How could they not take to my proposal? I had made such a good case for my cause, backed by facts, figures, and earlier community work. No, said the American director, not interested. How could they not be interested in a registered CBO that was going to donate books, desks, and chairs to kids living in Kibra, Africa's biggest slum? It was dark by the time I reached town from the donors' posh offices in suburban Nairobi. Rain was falling with a vengeance, and thunder groaned from an oak gray sky. My thoughts and emotions were tangled up like illicit lovers caught in the act. Determined to unravel the mystery behind donations, I called Getonga. a wizard at getting grants. He met me in a restaurant dangling Mercedes-Benz keys. When I explained my disappointment, he laughed loudly, displaying a horseshoe of upper teeth. My friend, he said at last, let me break it down for you. Donor aid is supply driven, not demand driven. These donor guys are not helping you, they're helping themselves through you. It's called the aristocracy of mercy. I leaned forward and Getonga went on. They don't care about you or your cause. If you want their donation or grant, you have to push something that fits with their current program, whatever that program might be. Toothbrushes for crocodiles, bras for female elephants, birth control for poor Africans, societal acceptance of gays and lesbians, wireless radios for pastoralists, controversial vaccines for infants, experimental HIV drugs, abortions for ghetto girls, whatever. There are no innocents here or abroad. Just go with the flow, and you'll also be able to arrive at your problems in a sleek Mercedes Benz.
Well, Alexander, I can't wait to read the poem, the poetry book. It sounds really amazing. So we are reaching the end of our conversation. First of all, I would once again remind our organizers, Neptune Good Read, Meta Reds, as well as Simon and Schuster. They are bringing this event to connect different continents, different writers with readership of Sri Lanka. So today we met an incredible poet from and a writer from Kenya, Alexander. So I wish you all the very best, Alexander, and it was a pleasure joining you and meeting you and having an in-depth conversation about your work and the background. So good well wishes from Sri Lanka, and it was so good to see you.
Oh, this was fabulous. I wish you all the best with the rest of the book fair. This was great.
Thank you.